Millionaire ignores a desperate mother's plea for help. Years later, his fortune collapses and he needs her help. A secret from the past unexpectedly connects their lives. The quest for forgiveness leads him to a decision that will change everything. From the penthouse of New York City's tallest skyscraper, Richard Montgomery surveyed the urban landscape through floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. At 52, he commanded one of the country's largest business empires. His face, marked by deep lines of expression, reflected not just the passage of years, but also the weight of decisions that had propelled him to the top. "Mr. Montgomery, the shareholders' meeting will begin in 5 minutes, announced Sarah, his secretary, interrupting his thoughts. Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie and picked up his leather briefcase. "Any news from Luke?" "Your partner. Called to say he's stuck in traffic, sir. The rain is causing gridlock all over the city." With an irritated sigh, Richard walked to the conference room. Luke Matthews, his business partner of 15 years, had the terrible habit of being late. For important engagements, it was his only flaw, Richard thought, compensated by his extraordinary ability to close impossible deals. In the conference room, 10 people waited in silence. The nervousness was palpable. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture emanating authority. "We'll start without Luke. We can't keep our investors waiting." As they discussed the latest quarterly results, the storm intensified outside. The numbers were impressive: record profits, international expansion, strategic acquisitions. Richard had built his empire with iron determination and a ruthless philosophy. In the business world, there was no room for sentimentality. The meeting was interrupted by urgent knocking on the door. Sarah entered, visibly disturbed. "Mr. Montgomery, I apologize for the interruption, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention." Richard frowned, annoyed by the intrusion. "Can't it wait?" "It's about the New Heights project, sir. There's been a problem." Richard's demeanor changed instantly. The New Heights project was his biggest bet of the year, a billion-dollar venture that would transform an entire area of the city. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I'll be back in a few minutes." In the hallway, Sarah quickly explained, "The local community is protesting. They say they weren't consulted about the evictions. The press is already on site. Where's Luke? He should be handling this. We still haven't been able to contact him, sir." Richard took out his cell phone, trying once again to reach his partner. No success. Something wasn't right. Luke never went off the grid, especially on such a crucial day. At that moment, a woman burst through the corridor, bypassing security. "Mr. Montgomery, please, I need to speak with you." Richard observed her. She was soaked from the rain, her eyes red from crying. Sarah tried to intercept her, but the woman was quicker. "My name is Helen Sanders. You're destroying our lives. That land, it's all we have. My son is sick. We need our home." "Ma'am, please, this is neither the time nor the place," Richard responded coldly. "All legal procedures were followed. If you have any complaints, contact our legal department." "Legal? You call it legal to evict families from their homes, people who've built their lives there?" Helen trembled, but her voice was firm. "We're willing to negotiate, to find a solution that benefits everyone." Richard checked his gold watch. "Sarah, call security and reschedule the shareholders' meeting for tomorrow." "Please," Helen begged, "just listen to us. There are children, elderly people." "Ma'am," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp as ice, "the world doesn't stop because of sentimentality. Evolution requires sacrifices. If some people need to get out of the way of progress, that's the price to pay." At that moment, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Luke. "We need to talk. Urgent. Don't trust anyone." Richard stared. At the phone screen, an uncomfortable sensation growing in his chest. For the first time in many years, he felt that something was about to slip out of his control. Outside, the storm raged over New York City, like an omen of what was to come. Helen Sanders left the corporate building with a heavy heart, but not defeated. The rain continued to fall mercilessly over New York City, but she barely felt it. Her worries were focused on her son, Michael, who was waiting at home with a high fever. The money for his medicine had gone to pay the lawyer trying to prevent the eviction from their home. At the bus stop, precariously protected by a worn-out umbrella, Helen watched luxury cars passing by. creating waves in the puddles that further soaked her feet. Her mind went back to the encounter with Richard Montgomery. How could someone be so cold, so detached from the reality of ordinary people? "Helen, is that really you?" She turned to find Charles Anderson, her old college professor whom she never got to graduate under. At 65, he maintained the same kind look and elegant posture that characterized him when she was his student. "Professor Charles, what a nice surprise." "My dear, it's been so long, but you're soaked. Come, let's have a coffee. I need to shelter from this rain anyway." In the nearest cafe, Helen poured out her anxieties. She told him about the fight against Montgomery's development company, about Michael, about how she had abandoned her dreams of graduating in business to raise her son alone. Charles listened attentively, his eyes revealing a mixture of compassion and something else, interest. "You know, Helen, perhaps this encounter is not mere coincidence. For 15 years I've been running an NGO focused on community development and social entrepreneurship. We're always in need of people with your grit and determination. Professor, I appreciate the offer, but right now I need to focus on saving my home and taking care of Michael." "What if I told you we could do both?" Charles smiled, taking a business card from his pocket. "We have an excellent legal department, specialized in community causes. And as for Michael, well, we have partnerships with some of the best clinics in the city." Helen held the card as if it were a lifeline. "Why would you help me like this, Professor?" "Because 15 years ago, I saw one of the brightest students I've ever had abandon her dreams. Now I see an even stronger and more determined woman. How about turning that strength into something bigger?" Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard Montgomery drove his imported car towards the location agreed upon with Luke. His partner's enigmatic message disturbed him more than he'd like to admit. 15 years of partnership, and for the first time Luke sounded genuinely scared. The phone rang. It was Sarah. "Mr. Montgomery, there's something you need to know. I just received an anonymous call. Someone is digging into old company transactions, especially those related to the beginning of your partnership with Mr. Matthews." Richard felt his stomach sink. Those transactions? No one could find out. He and Luke had made sure of that. "Sarah, cancel all my appointments for today, and don't mention this call to anyone." At a traffic light, Richard observed a family sheltering from the rain at a bus stop. For a moment, the image of Helen Sanders came back to his mind. Something in her eyes, in her determination, deeply unsettled him. He shook his head, pushing those thoughts away. Sensitivity was a luxury he couldn't afford at that moment. The phone vibrated again. Another message from Luke. "Change of plans. Don't come. They're watching. Protect the Phoenix Project files." Phoenix Project. Richard felt his blood run cold. That name shouldn't exist anymore. All records had been erased, all witnesses silenced with generous sums of money. How was this coming back to the surface now? He braked abruptly, startling pedestrians, crossing the street. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. He needed to think. Luke was clearly in trouble, but going to meet him now would be too risky. And what files should he protect? All documentation of the Phoenix Project had been destroyed years ago. A new message arrived, this time from an unknown number. "Mr. Montgomery, your fortress isn't as impenetrable as you think. You'll soon discover that the past always collects its dues." In the small living room of the apartment she shared with her son, Helen leafed through old photographs by the light of a lamp. Michael slept in the next room, his breathing calmer after taking the medicine that Professor Charles had provided. The last few weeks had brought changes that she was still trying to process. Professor Charles's NGO, New Horizons, turned out to be much more than a simple social organization. It was a center of power and transformation, with connections that reached the highest echelons of New York society. In just 15 days, Helen had already met influential people, participated in strategic meetings, and most importantly, discovered a new purpose. "Mom?" Michael's sleepy voice brought her back to the present. "It's late. You need to sleep." Helen smiled at her 15-year-old son. Michael had her same determined eyes, but his gentleness, that came from somewhere else, from someone she tried not to remember. "I was just organizing some things, son. How are you feeling?" "Much better. That doctor Professor Charles recommended is really good. Michael sat next to his mother, looking curiously at the photographs. Is that you in college? Helen nodded, touching a particular photo affectionately. In it, a group of students smiled in front of the business school. It was a different time. We thought we could change the world. And why can't you? Michael asked, his voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. That man, Montgomery, he won't win, Mom, not after everything we've discovered. Helen looked at her son, surprised. What do you mean, Michael? What have you discovered? The teenager hesitated for a moment. Promise you won't get mad? I've been researching Richard Montgomery, about his past, and I found something interesting about something called the Phoenix Project. Helen's heart raced. That name, why did it seem so familiar? Michael, where did you hear about this? On the internet. But that's not all. Yesterday, when I was at the NGO, I overheard Professor Charles talking about it with someone on the phone. He seemed worried. Helen stood up abruptly, her mind working quickly. Charles had never mentioned anything about Montgomery or any mysterious project. Why would he be investigating this now? The phone rang, startling mother and son. It was an unknown number. Hello? Helen? A male voice, tense and breathless, sounded from the other end. This is Luke Matthews, Richard Montgomery's partner. We need to talk. It's about your past and his. How did you get my number? That doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're in danger. Montgomery isn't who you think he is. And Professor Charles, be careful with him too. What are you talking about? What danger? Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the Palace Cafe. Come alone. And Helen, don't trust anyone. The call ended, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. Michael was watching her with concern. Mom, is everything okay? Helen forced a smile. Of course, son. It was just work. She put the photographs back in the box, but one of them slipped to the floor. As she picked it up, her heart stopped for a second. It was an old photo from her first year of college. In it, Helen smiled next to a young man who didn't appear in any other photo. A young man whose face she had tried to forget for 15 years. A face she now saw every day in the news. Richard Montgomery. In his office, Richard was also immersed in memories. The threatening message still echoed in his mind, but that wasn't what disturbed him. It was the feeling that something bigger was in motion, something that had begun a long time ago. Sarah, he called through the intercom, I need you to find everything you can about Helen Sanders, especially from her college days. Sir, I already have some information. She was your classmate at Columbia, dropped out in her third year. And there's one more thing. Her son, Michael, his date of birth coincides with... No, Richard interrupted her abruptly. That's impossible. It must be a coincidence. But as he looked out the window, observing the city he had helped transform, Richard knew there were no coincidences. The past was coming back to collect its debts, and the price might be higher than he was prepared to pay. The next morning, the Palace Cafe was nearly empty. Helen arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled time, choosing a discreet table at the back of the establishment. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup, her mind divided between curiosity and fear of what she was about to discover. Luke Matthews arrived punctually, but he wasn't the confident businessman that business magazines usually portrayed. He seemed tense, his eyes constantly scanning the environment. Thank you for coming, he said, sitting down. We don't have much time. Why did you call me here? What do you know about me? Luke took a brown envelope from his jacket. This is just a small part of what I found. Helen, do you know why Richard never married? Why he built an empire but lives completely alone? Helen felt her heart race. I'm not interested in his personal life. Even after what he did to you? After abandoning you when you were... Stop! Helen interrupted him, her voice louder than she intended. Some people looked in their direction. That's in the past. I've moved on. The past is never just the past, Helen, especially when it's connected to the Phoenix Project. Luke pushed the envelope towards her. Richard wasn't the only one involved. There were others, powerful people. Professor Charles, for example. Helen felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Charles? But he's helping me. Is he really? Or is he using you as part of a bigger plan? Luke leaned forward, lowering his voice. 15 years ago, the Phoenix Project wasn't just a real estate development. It was a complex operation to take control of strategic areas of the city. Richard, Charles, me, we all had our roles. And what was your role? I was the intermediary. The man who knew all the secrets, all the connections. Luke laughed bitterly. You know what happens to people like that? They become targets. On the other side of the city, Richard Montgomery was facing his own crisis. The information Sarah had gathered about Helen was disturbing. Not only did it confirm his suspicions about Michael, but it revealed a web of connections he had never imagined. Sir, Sarah rushed into his office. I just received information. Luke Matthews is right now with Helen Sanders at the Palace Cafe. Richard felt his world spin. Luke knew. He had always known. That's why his partner had been acting so strange in recent weeks. But why seek out Helen now? Sarah, prepare the car and cancel all my meetings for today. Sir, there's one more thing. Professor Charles Anderson requested an urgent meeting. He said it's about the old New Heights site. Richard froze. Charles Anderson. That name brought back memories he preferred to keep buried. When does he want to meet? This afternoon. He was quite insistent. At the Palace Cafe, the conversation between Helen and Luke was reaching a crucial point. What exactly is in this envelope? Helen asked, her hands touching the brown paper, but without the courage to open it. The truth about Richard Montgomery, about Michael's father, and about how all of this is connected to what's happening now. Luke nervously checked his watch. But you need to understand something. Opening this envelope means there's no turning back. You'll be involved in something bigger than you imagine. Helen thought of Michael, of their threatened home, of all the coincidences of the past few days. Why are you helping me? Luke smiled sadly. Let's say I'm trying to correct past mistakes. But Helen, you need to know that. He never finished the sentence. His phone vibrated with a message that made his face pale. We need to go now. They've discovered we're here. Who's they? The same people who turned the Phoenix Project into something much bigger than a simple real estate project. The people Richard Montgomery really fears. As they hurriedly left the cafe, Helen clutched the envelope to her chest. Inside it, documents, photographs, and records held secrets that would forever change her life and the lives of everyone around her. What she didn't know yet was that some truths are more dangerous than lies, and that certain revelations have the power to destroy not just the present, but also completely rewrite the past. Professor Charles Anderson's office at the New Horizons NGO contrasted with the modernity of the rest of the building. Antique furniture, walls lined with books, and black and white photographs created an atmosphere that harkened back to another time. It was here that Richard Montgomery waited, observing one photograph in particular, the graduating class of 1995. Simpler times, weren't they? Charles entered the room, his steps soft on the Persian carpet. When our biggest problems were low grades and broken hearts. Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on a specific face in the photograph, Helen, so young, so full of dreams. Why did you call me here, Charles? Straight to the point, as always. Charles sat in his leather armchair, gesturing for Richard to do the same. I received an interesting proposal about the New Heights site, an alternative that could benefit all involved parties. There are no alternatives. The project will proceed as planned. Even if it means facing public opinion, the protests are growing, Richard, and now with Helen leading the residents' resistance. Richard stood up abruptly. What do you know about Helen? An enigmatic smile appeared on Charles's lips. Perhaps the question is, what don't you want others to know about her? He opened a drawer, taking out an old folder. You know, I always kept detailed records of my students, especially those who showed unique potential. In Helen's apartment, Michael was rummaging through the contents of the envelope Luke had given her. His mother was in the shower, and teenage curiosity spoke louder. Among the documents, a birth certificate caught his attention. His own birth certificate, but with information he had never seen before. Michael? Helen's voice caught him by surprise. She was standing in the doorway, her hair still wet, a look of shock on her face. "What are you doing?" "Mom, why did you never tell me the truth about my father?" Helen felt her legs weaken. She sat down next to her son, silent tears running down her face. "Some truths are too complicated, son. Richard Montgomery. He's my father, isn't he?" Michael held the document with trembling hands. "Is that why we're fighting against him? For revenge?" "No." Helen held her son's hands. "Our fight is for justice, for our home, for our community. The past is just that, past." "Then why did Luke Matthews contact you? Why is Professor Charles so interested in helping us? There's something bigger going on, isn't there?" Before Helen could answer, her phone rang. It was an unknown number again. "Helen? This is Sarah, Mr. Montgomery's secretary." The voice on the other end sounded tense. "He needs to speak with you. It's urgent." "I have nothing to say to him. It's about Professor Charles and about the real reason he's helping you." In Charles's office, the conversation between the two men was reaching a critical point. "What do you want, Charles?" Richard asked, his voice laden with contained tension. "I want what I've always wanted. Justice." Charles opened the folder, revealing documents yellowed by time. 15 years ago, you, Luke, and other powerful individuals created the Phoenix Project. You used my research, my studies on urban development, for something that should never have happened. You were well compensated for that. Money? Charles laughed bitterly. You think it was about money. Richard, you destroyed lives. You turned an urban revitalization project into a machine for destroying entire communities. And now you're about to do it again. It's progress, Charles. There's always a price to pay. And what about the price Helen paid? That Michael is still paying today? Richard paled. Leave them out of this. Too late. Charles stood up, walking to the window. You know why I chose Helen to lead our movement against you? It wasn't a coincidence, it was destiny, or rather it was poetic justice. In the apartment, Helen finally made a decision. Sarah, tell your boss I agree to talk, but on one condition. I want all the original documents from the Phoenix Project. All of them. It's not that simple. Yes, it is, because I know where to look. And if he doesn't cooperate, other people will know too. After hanging up, Helen hugged Michael. Son, I need you to stay at Aunt Martha's house tonight. There are some things I need to resolve. Mom, I'm not going to leave you alone in this. Michael, please. Helen held her son's face between her hands. 15 years ago, I made decisions thinking I was protecting you. Now I need to fix some past mistakes. But first I need to make sure you're safe. What Helen didn't know was that at that exact moment, other forces were in motion. Luke Matthews had disappeared after their meeting at the cafe. Professor Charles was making mysterious calls in his office, and Richard Montgomery, for the first time in 15 years, felt control slipping from his hands. The storm brewing over New York City was just a prelude to what was to come. Because some truths, once revealed, have the power to transform not just the present, but also completely redefine the future. Night was falling over New York when Sarah rushed into Richard Montgomery's office. She found her boss standing by. The window, the reflection of the setting sun casting elongated shadows across his tense face. Sir, Helen agreed to talk, but she demanded the Phoenix Project documents. Sarah hesitated for a moment. And there's one more thing. Luke Matthews. No one has been able to locate him since this morning. Richard ran his hand over his face, a rare gesture of vulnerability. Sarah, after 15 years of working together, do you trust me? Of course, sir. Even knowing there are things in my past, decisions I'm not proud of? Sarah approached her boss, her expression softening. Mr. Montgomery, Richard, we all have a past. What matters is what we do now. Helen is right to hate me, he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. I abandoned her when she needed me most, out of ambition, out of fear, out of cowardice. And now? Richard turned to face his secretary. Now I need to prevent Charles from using Helen and Michael in his game of revenge, because that's what he's doing, Sarah, using them to destroy me. At the New Horizons, NGO Charles Anderson was receiving an unexpected visit. Mary Wilson, one of the oldest residents of New Heights, brought worrying news. "Professor, people are restless. There are rumors circulating that you're negotiating with Montgomery behind our backs." Charles served coffee to his visitor, his habitual calm masking his true intentions. "Mary, trust me. Every step I take is calculated. Helen is doing an exceptional job mobilizing the community, isn't she?" "Yes, but—" Mary hesitated. "There are comments about her son, about the boy's father." "Gossip doesn't interest us," Charles cut in sharply. "What matters is our cause." After Mary's departure, Charles picked up his phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart, but rarely used. "Is everything prepared for tomorrow?" "Excellent. Montgomery will have no choice but to show up, and when he does—" At her sister Martha's apartment, Helen was tucking Michael into bed in the guest room. "Son, promise me you'll stay here, that you won't try to follow me." "Mum, please, explain to me what's going on. If Richard Montgomery is really my father, I have the right to know the whole truth." Helen sat on the edge of the bed, her hands caressing her son's hair. "Michael, 15 years ago, I was a business student full of ideals. Your father, Richard, he was different then. Or maybe I just didn't want to see who he really was." "Did you love each other?" "I believed we did. But when I told him about the pregnancy, he changed. The Phoenix Project was just starting. It was his big chance for advancement. An unplanned child with a scholarship student wasn't part of his plans. And Professor Charles, how does he fit into all this?" Helen sighed deeply. "Charles was more than a professor. He was a mentor, to me and to Richard. But something happened during the Phoenix Project, something that changed all of us." At that moment, Helen's cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from a blocked number. "New Heights, midnight. Bring the documents Luke gave you. You're not the only one Richard abandoned." In his office, Richard prepared for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. Years of secrets, lies, and questionable decisions had created a complex web that now threatened to suffocate him. Sarah entered with a folder in her hands. "The documents you asked for, sir, but are you sure you want to do this?" "I have no choice, Sarah. Charles is using Helen and Michael as pawns in his game of revenge. I need to tell the truth before—" "Sir, it's too late." "What truth?" Richard opened the folder, revealing an old photograph. In it, 3 young people smiled at the camera: himself, Helen, and a woman who looked strikingly like Sarah. "The truth about why the Phoenix Project really began. And about your sister, Sarah, about how she was the first victim of our ambitions." Sarah staggered, needing to lean on the desk to avoid falling. "My sister? You knew her?" "She was much more than just another person we harmed, Sarah. She was the reason why it all started. And now, 15 years later, Charles is using Helen to complete the cycle of revenge he's been planning all this time." Night advanced over New York City, each minute bringing the characters in this drama closer to an inevitable confrontation. In New Heights, shadows moved between the alleys, preparing for the events that would turn that night into a milestone in the history of all involved. Because some truths, when finally revealed, have the power to heal old wounds, or to open new, even deeper ones. New Heights took on ghostly contours under the moonlight. Helen walked through familiar alleys, Luke Matthews' envelope secure in her bag. Each shadow seemed to hide secrets. Each sound carried the weight of expectation. In her apartment before leaving, she had made one last discovery. Hidden among the documents Luke had given her, she found a letter addressed to her, dated 15 years ago. The handwriting was unmistakable. Beth Williams, Sarah's sister. "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, something went wrong. The Phoenix Project isn't what it seems. Richard, Charles, all of them are lying. I discovered something terrible, something that goes far beyond simple real estate speculation. I need you to keep this information. It's our only protection. With love, Beth." The letter ended abruptly, as if Beth had been interrupted. Helen never knew what happened to her friend. One day she simply disappeared, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions. In the office of Montgomery Developments, Richard and Sarah faced their own revelations. "My sister, Sarah held the old photograph with trembling hands. Why did you never tell me you knew her? Because the truth was too complex. Richard sat down heavily. Beth was brilliant, Sarah. She discovered irregularities in our projects, connections that no one should know about. I tried to protect her, but what? Charles. He convinced her to keep investigating, promised support. I warned her. So it was dangerous, that there were powerful people involved, people who wouldn't hesitate to... A shrill sound interrupted the conversation. Richard's cell phone displayed a message. New Heights, midnight. Beth's documents in exchange for the truth. At Martha's house, Michael couldn't sleep. The revelations about his father, the mystery surrounding Professor Charles, everything was spinning in his mind. He got up silently, determined to find answers. In the living room, he found his aunt on the phone. Charles, this isn't right, Martha whispered. Helen trusts you, using her past like this. Michael froze. His aunt knew Professor Charles? How? I don't care if it's for a good cause, Martha continued. Beth already paid the price 15 years ago. I won't let the same happen to my sister. At the NGO headquarters, Charles Anderson was making his own preparations. On his desk, old photos told a story that few knew. In one of them, he appeared next to Beth Williams, both smiling in front of a plot of land that today was part of Montgomery's empire. Professor, a young voice surprised him. It was Paul, one of the NGO coordinators. We found something in the archives you asked for, about the old New Heights social housing project. Charles took the folder Paul offered. Inside, blueprints and documents revealed the original project, a model housing complex with green areas and public facilities, a dream that never came true. You know, Paul, Charles spoke, his voice laden with bitterness. 15 years ago, this project could have transformed the lives of thousands of people. But Richard Montgomery and his allies had other plans. They turned a social project into a speculation scheme. And this Beth Williams? The documents mention her several times. Beth... Charles removed his glasses, cleaning them methodically. She was my best student, idealistic like Helen, perhaps too idealistic. In New Heights, the streets were beginning to come alive in an unusual way for that time. Residents discreetly observed through windows as unfamiliar cars circulated slowly through the alleys. Among them, a taxi brought Michael, who had escaped from his aunt's house. Helen arrived at the meeting point 10 minutes before midnight. The location was an old square, surrounded by houses that might soon be demolished. Each bench, each tree, carried memories of a life she was fighting to preserve. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sarah. You came, said Montgomery's secretary. Why you? Because I also have a right to the truth, about my sister, about what really happened 15 years ago. Before Helen could respond, headlights illuminated the square. 2 cars were approaching from opposite directions. From one of them, Richard Montgomery stepped out. From the other, Professor Charles Anderson. The clock struck midnight. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. There in that simple square in New Heights, secrets kept for 15 years were about to come to light. Truths that would forever change the lives of all present. What none of them knew was that Michael was observing everything hidden, his heart beating fast as he witnessed the beginning of a confrontation that would reveal not just his true past, but also the future of all involved. The air in the New Heights square was thick with tension. The 4 figures stared at each other in silence, each carrying their own version of the truth, their own wounds from the past. I see we all decided to show up. Charles was the first to speak, his voice echoing in the night. Although some of us weren't invited. His gaze turned to Richard. It's over, Charles. Richard stepped forward. I won't allow you to use Helen and Michael in your personal vendetta. Helen looked from one to the other, her mind working quickly. What is he talking about, Charles? What vendetta? Don't be a hypocrite, Richard. Charles laughed bitterly. You talk about protecting Helen and Michael now, after 15 years, after everything you did. Sarah intervened, her voice trembling. And my sister. Is anyone going to tell me what happened to Beth? The name seemed to electrify the atmosphere. Helen took the letter from her bag. Maybe this will help clarify some things. Beth wrote this before she disappeared. Hidden behind a nearby tree, Michael observed the scene, his heart beating fast. For the first time he saw his father up close, without the filter of magazine photographs or news reports. "Your sister discovered something she shouldn't have." "Sarah," Charles explained, his eyes fixed on Richard. "Something about the true purpose of the Phoenix Project. It wasn't just about real estate speculation, it was about power, about control." "What are you talking about?" Helen asked. "The Phoenix Project," Richard interrupted, "started as a dream. An urban revitalization project that would benefit thousands of people. Charles was the mentor, the idealist. I was just an ambitious young man with the right connections." "And Beth?" Sarah insisted. "Beth was too brilliant for her own good," Charles continued. "She discovered that big businessmen and politicians were using the project as a front for something bigger. A scheme that involved money laundering, bribes." "Stop!" Richard shouted. "You have no right to—" "To what?" "Tell the truth." Charles approached Helen. "Do you know why he abandoned you when you were pregnant? Because Beth warned him. She showed him proof that the empire he would build would be based on corruption and suffering." Helen felt her legs weaken. "Richard, is it true?" Richard looked at Helen, then at the spot where Michael was hiding. He had noticed his son's presence from the start. "Yes and no. Beth showed me the evidence, that's true, but that's not why I distanced myself. It was to protect you." "Protect?" Charles laughed. "Tell the truth, Richard. Tell how you chose power over love. How you sacrificed your own family for ambition." "No," Richard advanced towards Charles. "You don't know everything. You don't know that Beth—" "That Beth what?" Sarah intercepted, tears streaming down her face. At that moment, a new voice cut through the night. "That Beth is alive." Everyone turned. Luke Matthews emerged from the shadows, and beside him, "Beth," Sarah sobbed, recognizing her sister, now 15 years older but unmistakable. Beth Williams took a step forward, her eyes scanning each face present. "It's time for everyone to know the truth, all of it." Michael, unable to contain himself any longer, came out of his hiding place. "Mom?" Helen ran to her son, hugging him protectively. Richard observed the scene with a mixture of pain and regret in his eyes. "Michael should hear this too," Beth spoke softly. "After all, this story is about him too. About how a project that was supposed to improve people's lives turned into a web of lies and betrayals. And about how sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true redemption." Luke took a flash drive from his pocket. "Here's everything. All the documents, all the evidence. The real Phoenix Project. Not the version Richard and Charles told the world." The night had only just begun. In the square of New Heights, under the starry sky of New York City, secrets kept for 15 years were about to be revealed. Truths that would forever change the destiny of all present. And Michael, observing the tense faces around him, realized he was about to discover not just the truth about his father, but about a past that had shaped his very existence in ways he could never have imagined. The silence that followed Beth's arrival was dense, laden with 15 years of unrevealed secrets. Sarah was the first to move, running to embrace the sister she thought she had lost. The two cried while the others watched the scene with conflicting emotions. "Why, Beth?" Sarah asked between sobs. "Why let everyone think you had—" "Because it was the only way to protect everyone," Beth answered, her gaze sweeping over those present until it fixed on Helen. "Especially you and your son." Helen instinctively hugged Michael tighter. Richard took a step forward, but Charles stopped him. "No, Richard, you lost the right to interfere 15 years ago." "You don't understand, Charles," Richard retorted, his voice laden with an emotion that surprised everyone. "You never understood. Everything I did was for power," Charles interrupted him. "For ambition." "It was for love," Richard exploded, unexpected tears in his eyes. "For love of Helen, of Michael, of everything we built." Luke cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Maybe it's better if we show what's on the flash drive." The true story of the Phoenix Project. Beth nodded, taking a laptop from her bag. As she connected the flash drive, she began to explain. The Phoenix Project was born from a genuine dream. Charles had a revolutionary vision of sustainable urban development. Richard had the business connections. I was the researcher who discovered something much bigger. On the computer screen, images and documents began to appear. Architectural plans, contracts, emails. Look, Beth pointed to a specific document. The original project provided for the complete revitalization of degraded areas, maintaining local communities. But then we discovered the truth about the lands, Luke completed, about their true origin. Michael, who was observing everything attentively, noticed how his mother paled. "Mum, what is it?" Helen took a step forward, her voice trembling. "The lands, they belonged to my family, didn't they? Is that why you approached me, Richard?" Richard closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. "At first, yes. You were the last heir of the Sanders. Your family had lost everything, but the rights to the lands still existed. We needed you to legitimize the project." But then something changed, Beth intervened, a soft smile on her lips. "Didn't it, Richard?" "I fell in love," he admitted, looking directly at Helen. "Truly, deeply. And when I found out you were pregnant, you ran away," Helen completed bitterly. "No," Richard protested. "I tried to protect you." Because that same week, Beth discovered something terrible about our main investors. Charles gave a dry laugh. "Ah, yes, the true owners of power in New York. They weren't just businessmen," Beth explained, opening more files on the computer. "They were people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who crossed their path. When I discovered the evidence of their illegal activities, I understood that we were all in danger." Michael, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "So my father didn't abandon us. He was trying to protect us?" "Yes and no," Beth answered, softly. "Richard made choices, some right, some wrong, but everything started to change when Charles discovered the truth about his own participation in the scheme. All eyes turned to the professor, who for the first time seemed to have lost his confident posture. "What is she talking about, Charles?" Helen asked. "About the real reason he approached you after all these years," Luke answered. "About why he really created the New Horizons NGO." Charles stumbled, leaning on a bench in the square. "You don't understand. I had to fix my mistakes. I had to do something to compensate." "To compensate for what?" Richard asked, his voice now softer. "To compensate for the fact that it was he who gave the information about Helen's family to the investors," Beth revealed. "It was Charles who made it possible for them to manipulate the situation from the beginning." Thunder sounded in the distance, as if the sky was responding to the revelations unfolding in that square. The story of the Phoenix Project was just beginning to be revealed, and with it, truths that would forever transform the lives of all present. Michael looked at his father, then at his mother, and finally at Professor Charles. In his 15 years of life, he had never imagined that his family history could contain so many layers of complexity, love, betrayal, and redemption. The night was still long, and there was much more to be revealed, because each truth unveiled seemed to bring with it new questions, new mysteries to be unraveled. Beth's account continued, her calm voice contrasting with the weight of the revelations she was making. On the laptop screen, more documents appeared, telling a story that went far beyond simple real estate speculation. "When I discovered the truth about the investors," she explained, "I realized we needed a plan. Richard had already tried to warn me about the risks, but I was young, idealistic. I thought the truth would always prevail." Sarah, still holding her sister's hand, asked, "Is that why you faked your own?" "It was Richard's idea," Beth responded, surprising everyone. "He organized everything, created a new identity for me, ensured my safety. It was the only way to continue investigating without putting anyone at risk." Helen looked at Richard with new eyes. "So all these years," Richard completed, "I worked to dismantle the scheme from the inside. Each deal, each acquisition was planned to give us access to more information, more evidence. And I," Luke added, "was the contact between Richard and—" "Beth, That's why I had to maintain my role as the ambitious and unscrupulous partner. No one could suspect. Charles stood up from the bench, his normally imposing figure now seeming smaller, more fragile. But why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe? Because you weren't trustworthy, Beth answered gently. Your guilt over what you had done to Helen's family made you unpredictable. You created the NGO, started helping communities, but you were also planning your revenge against Richard. Michael, who had listened to everything attentively, turned to Beth. But now, why reveal all this now? Because we finally have all the evidence, Luke responded, pointing to the flash drive. Documents, recordings, bank transfers, everything we need to expose the real criminals without putting anyone at risk. Helen sat down slowly, trying to process all the information. So, the New Heights project is the last piece of the puzzle, Richard explained. The same investors from the past are involved, but this time we were prepared. That's why you approached me through the NGO, Helen spoke, looking at Charles. You thought you were using me to get to Richard, but actually, Beth smiled. You were a fundamental part of the plan. Your genuine fight for the community, your leadership. All of this gave us the perfect cover for the final blow. Charles ran his hand through his graying hair, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. So I, who thought I was manipulating everyone, was actually the only one being manipulated. No, Richard answered, approaching his former mentor. You gave us something precious, Charles. Your NGO, your work with the communities, that's real. It's your true legacy, not the revenge you were planning. Michael, who had remained quiet for a while, finally asked the question that burned in his chest. Dad, why did you never try to contact us, even if it was dangerous? Richard looked at his son, unchecked tears running down his face. I tried, many times. I observed you from afar, followed every step of your life through Sarah, but getting close would have meant putting you in the crosshairs of those we were still investigating. Helen stood up, walking to Richard. All these years, I hated you. I turned you into the villain of my story. And I deserved it, Richard responded softly. My choices, even if well-intentioned, caused pain, a lot of pain. But now, Beth intervened, we have the chance to fix things. The New Heights project can be what it should have always been, a truly transformative project for the community. Luke took out his cell phone, showing a message. The operation has already begun. The evidence is being delivered to the authorities as we speak. In a few hours, the whole scheme will come to light. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, the first rays of sun tinting the clouds pink and gold. In the New Heights Square, 8 people remained gathered, each processing the night's revelations in their own way. Michael looked at his parents, then at the other people who in one way or another had shaped his story. There was hurt there, yes, but also hope. The hope that sometimes what seems to be the end of a story can be just the beginning of another. The sun was already high when the group finally left the New Heights Square. The night's revelations had changed everything, but there was still much to be done. Helen and Michael walked side by side with Richard, a silence laden with possibilities between them. We need to talk about the future, Richard spoke softly, breaking the silence. About the New Heights project, about us. Helen stopped, turning to face him. 15 years, Richard. 15 years of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights, of solitary struggles. I know, he responded, the guilt evident in his voice. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for every lost moment, if you'll allow me. Michael observed his parents' interaction with a mixture of hope and apprehension. What's going to happen now, with the project, with the community? Before Richard could answer, a commotion caught his attention. Residents were beginning to gather in the streets, some pointing to their cell phones. Luke approached quickly, his own phone in hand. It's started, he announced. The first news is already leaking. The main players are being summoned to give statements. Beth, who was talking with Sarah nearby, joined the group. The operation was a success, years of investigation finally yielding results. Charles observed everything from a distance, his solitary figure contrasting with the growing agitation. Helen, noticing his isolation, approached her former professor. "You know, Charles, despite everything, that your NGO made a difference in many people's lives. But for the wrong reasons," he responded bitterly. "Everything I did was based on guilt, on a desire for revenge. The motives might have been complicated," Helen conceded, "but the good you did was real. The lives you transformed, the opportunities you created, that can't be erased." Meanwhile, Richard was receiving an important call. His face lit up as he heard the news. "The board of directors is calling an emergency meeting. They want to completely reformulate the New Heights project, following the original guidelines." "The guidelines you and Beth developed 15 years ago?" Michael asked, surprising everyone with his knowledge. Richard smiled at his son. "Exactly. A project that truly benefits the community, without forced relocations, with direct participation of residents in decisions." Sarah, who had remained quieter since the revelations about her sister, finally spoke up. "And what about the NGO, all the work that was built?" "The NGO will continue," Beth answered, putting an arm around her sister's shoulders. "But now with full transparency, without hidden agendas. Charles created something important there, something that can make even more of a difference now." Luke checked his phone again, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Montgomery developments. Stocks are rising. The market is reacting positively to the commitment to social responsibility." "It's not about the market," Richard corrected, surprising even himself. "It's about doing the right thing, finally." Helen observed the man beside her, noticing the subtle changes in his posture, in his gaze. The Richard Montgomery she had known in college, the idealistic young man who had lost his way amid ambition and fear, seemed to be resurfacing. "Michael," she called her son, "what do you think about having breakfast together? The three of us?" The teenager looked at his parents, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Can we go to Mrs. Wilson's bakery? She always keeps warm cheese bread for me." "Of course," Richard answered, emotion transparent in his voice. I've never tried Mrs. Wilson's cheese bread." As the trio walked away, Charles watched the scene with misty eyes. Beth approached him, offering an understanding smile. "You know, Professor, there's still a lot of work to be done, and we need your experience, your knowledge. Only now, without secrets, without revenge, just the genuine desire to transform lives." The morning sun bathed New Heights in a different light. In the streets, residents were beginning their daily routines, still unaware that this would be a historic day for their community. A day when long-buried truths came to light, not to destroy, but to rebuild. Because sometimes it's necessary to face the past not just to understand it, but to create a different future. A future built not on secrets and lies, but on truth, forgiveness, and the courage to start over. Mrs. Wilson's bakery was a small oasis of normality amid a day that was far from normal. The aroma of fresh coffee and newly baked bread filled the air as Helen, Richard, and Michael occupied a table at the back of the establishment. It was the first meal they were having together in 15 years, or in Michael's case, the first ever. "So," Mrs. Wilson approached the table, her warm smile lighting up her time-worn face, "I finally met our Michael's father. You know, this boy is the best helper I've ever had on Saturday mornings?" Richard looked at his son in surprise. "You work here?" "Just on weekends," Michael responded, a slight blush tinging his cheeks. "I started by helping with deliveries, and Mrs. Wilson taught me how to make bread." Helen observed the interaction between father and son, her emotions in conflict. There was so much lost time, so many moments that would never return. But there was also something new being born here, something fragile and precious. On the other side of New Heights, the New Horizons NGO was buzzing with activity. Charles, Beth, and Luke were organizing an emergency meeting with community leaders. News about the investigations and the project's reformulation was already spreading, generating a mixture of hope and apprehension. "People need to understand that this time it's different," Beth explained to a group of residents. "We have legal guarantees, we have transparency in the process. And we have to thank you," an elderly lady spoke up. "You who never gave up fighting for the truth." Charles, who was observing everything from his corner, felt the weight of his former motivations. how to transform years of vengeful planning into something truly positive. Sarah, who had taken charge of organizing the documents, found an old photo among the files. In it, young students, including Helen, Richard, and Beth, posed in front of the business school, hopeful smiles on their faces. "We were so different then," Beth commented, looking at the photo over her sister's shoulder. "So full of certainties." "And now," Sarah asked, "what happens?" "Now," Luke answered, joining them, "we build something new, something true." At the bakery, between bites of cheese bread and sips of coffee, a family tried to rebuild long-broken bridges. "You have my eyes," Richard commented softly, observing Michael. "But the smile is just like your mother's." "And the stubbornness," Helen added, "that he inherited from both of us." Michael played with the crumbs on his plate, gathering courage to ask the question that was consuming him. Do you think we can be a family, even after so much time?" The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of Richard's cell phone. It was a message from Luke. "Meeting at the NGO in an hour. We need all three of you here." At the NGO headquarters, Charles finally found his redemption amid piles of genuine social projects he had developed over the years. Beth was right. The good he had done, even if initially motivated by guilt, was real and tangible. "Professor," a young volunteer called him, "the residents are asking about the professional training classes. Can we keep the program?" Charles looked at Beth, who nodded encouragingly. "Not only will we keep it," he answered, "but we're going to expand it. It's time to transform this NGO into what it should have always been." When Helen, Richard, and Michael arrived at the NGO, they found the environment transformed. Where there was once tension and secrets, now there was a different energy, a sense of possibilities. "Welcome to the new Phoenix project," Luke announced, presenting updated plans and projects. A true rebirth this time. Helen looked at Richard, then at her son. 15 years ago, she was a young student, in love with a college classmate, carrying dreams and the weight of a traditional surname. Now she was a strong woman, a community leader and mother to an extraordinary teenager. "You know," she spoke, her voice laden with emotion, "they say we can't change the past. But maybe we can. Give it a different meaning." Richard hesitantly took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Michael watched his parents with a smile, while around them an entire community prepared for a new beginning. Because sometimes true rebirth isn't about erasing the past, but about using its lessons to build a better future. A future where truth and reconciliation go hand in hand, and where old wounds can finally begin to heal. 6 months passed since the revelations of that night in New Heights. The neighborhood, which once lived under the shadow of uncertainty, now pulsed with a different energy. Cranes and construction machines moved through the streets, but this time not to demolish, but to build. In the temporary office set up in the community center, Helen coordinated a meeting with residents' representatives. The plans for the new project covered the walls, showing green areas, professional training centers, and housing that respected local history. "And here," she pointed to a specific area of the project, "we'll have the new headquarters of the New Horizons NGO, integrated with the cultural center managed by the community itself." Ms. Helen, an elderly lady, raised her hand. "Is it true that Professor Charles is going to teach again?" Helen smiled, remembering the transformation of her former mentor. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson. Charles discovered that his true vocation was always education. He'll coordinate the educational programs at the center." Outside the room, Michael observed his mother with pride. At 16, he had grown not just in height, but in understanding. The afternoons spent with Richard, it was still strange to call him Dad, had filled in some of the gaps in his story. "She's amazing, isn't she?" Richard approached his son, offering a cup of coffee. His visits to the neighborhood, once so rare, were now part of his routine. "How could you leave her?" Michael asked, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity. Richard sighed, carefully choosing his words. "You know, son, sometimes we make choices thinking we're protecting those we love. It's only later we realize there are other forms of protection, more honest, braver ones. Like now." "Like now," Richard agreed, observing through the window the movement of people working on the project. Each day is a chance to do things differently, to do better. In the new headquarters of Montgomery Developments, Beth occupied an office with a view of the city. As Director of Social Responsibility, she ensured that the company never strayed from its ethical principles again. Sarah, now her direct assistant, entered with a stack of documents. "The latest reports from the New Heights project," Sarah announced. "And Luke wanted to let you know that the meeting with international investors was a success. They're impressed with the sustainable development model." Beth smiled, picking up a photo on her desk. In it, the group that had gathered on that fateful night now posed in front of the construction site of the new project. Who would have thought we'd need to lose so much to finally find the right path? At the community center, the meeting had ended. Helen was organizing her papers when she felt a familiar presence. Charles was standing in the doorway, his face more serene than she had ever seen it. "You know, Helen," he began, "I spent years planning revenge, convinced it was justice, but you taught me that true justice is building something better." "We all learn, Professor," she responded, using the title with genuine affection, "each in our own way." Outside, the afternoon sun gilded the contours of New Heights. Michael walked with Richard towards Mrs. Wilson's bakery, a ritual they had established in recent weeks. "Dad," Michael called, the word still new on his tongue, "do you think we can do it? Make it work? Not just the project, but everything?" Richard stopped, looking at his son. In the teenager's face, he saw traces of Helen, of himself, but mostly he saw hope. "You know, Michael, I've learned that when we build something with truth, with real love, the chances of it working out are much greater." At the bakery, Mrs. Wilson was already waiting for them with fresh bread and coffee. It was a small moment of normality amid so many changes, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the ones that matter most. New Heights continued its transformation, not just physical, but mainly human. Because in the end, it wasn't the buildings or projects that made the difference, but the people who, after so long, finally found their place and each other. It was a special Sunday in New Heights. The cultural center, the first completed work of the new project, was to be inaugurated. From early on, residents and visitors circulated around the site, admiring the building that blended modern architecture with elements that preserved the neighborhood's identity. Helen was on the improvised stage, adjusting the microphone for her speech. In the front row, Michael smiled encouragingly. Beside him, Richard adjusted his tie, no longer as a symbol of power, but of respect for the occasion. "A year ago," Helen began, her voice clear and firm, "we were all here fighting not to lose our homes, our stories, our community. Today we're gathered to celebrate not just a new building, but a new chapter in our lives." In the middle rows, Beth and Sarah sat with Luke. The three had become inseparable, united no longer by secrets, but by their commitment to the transformation they helped realize. "This cultural center," Helen continued, "is more than a building. It's proof that when we choose truth, no matter how difficult it is to face, we make room for something better to be born." Charles, sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium, felt every word. His room in the new center was ready, waiting for the students who would start classes next week. On his desk, an old photo of the college class would serve as a constant reminder of where it all began and how much they had grown since then. After the speech, as people circulated through the new space, Michael found his parents talking in a quieter corner. "So," he teased, "when are you going to tell me about last night's dinner?" Helen blushed slightly, while Richard tried to hide a smile. They had gone out to dinner for the first time in 15 years, just the two of them, without the weight of the past between them. As the day progressed, the cultural center buzzed with activity. Residents explored the new facilities, from the state-of-the-art library to the community theater. The air was filled with a sense of hope and possibility that had been absent from New Heights for far too long. In the following weeks and months, the transformation of New Heights continued. The housing project, now redesigned with input from the community, began to take shape. Families who had feared displacement now looked forward to moving into homes that respected their needs and preserved their sense of community. Richard, true to his word, became a regular presence in the neighborhood. He worked tirelessly alongside Helen and the community leaders to ensure that every aspect of the project stayed true to its renewed vision. His relationship with Michael grew stronger, filled with conversations about the past, present, and future. The New Horizons NGO, under Charles's renewed leadership and with Beth's guidance, expanded its programs. It became a model for community development, attracting attention and support from across the country. As for Helen and Richard, their relationship evolved slowly but steadily. The wounds of the past began to heal, replaced by a deeper understanding and a shared commitment to building a better future, not just for themselves and Michael, but for the entire community they had come to cherish. 1 year after the inauguration of the Cultural Center, the group gathered again in Mrs. Wilson's bakery. As they shared coffee and pastries, each reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You know," Beth said, raising her coffee cup, "I think the real Phoenix Project was us, all of us. We rose from the ashes of our past mistakes and created something beautiful. To new beginnings," Luke added, joining the toast. "And to the power of truth," Charles chimed in, a serene smile on his face. As they clinked their cups together, Helen looked around the table. At Richard, who had found his way back to the idealistic man she had fallen in love with. At Michael, who had grown into a thoughtful and compassionate young man. At Beth, Sarah, Luke, and Charles, once adversaries, now allies, in a shared vision. Outside, the sounds of construction mingled with the laughter of children playing in the new community park. New Heights was living up to its name, rising above its troubled past to become a beacon of hope and renewal. Helen realized that their story, with all its twists and turns, its pain and redemption, was far from over. But now they were writing it together, guided by honesty, compassion, and a shared dream of a better future. As the sun set on another day in New Heights, casting a golden glow over the transformed neighborhood, Helen felt a deep sense of peace. They had faced their past, confronted difficult truths, and emerged stronger. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led them here. To a place of new beginnings, second chances, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.